and I have many enough years of experience doing UX things, UX research. And really, today's talk, it's really just a reflection, collection of my thoughts around unmoderated research and what I think are recommended design patterns for running unmoderated research or um, anti patterns as well. Um, I'm drawing upon my experience really, you know, as doing UX things, as a designer. I've done research in academia. Uh, I am currently a researcher in industry, but most importantly, and I think I'll always harp on this, is also as a research participant, because I get the impression that a lot of people don't do research who are actually executing research. And I find it a little bit ironic in some ways when we think about user experience, where it's a little bit of a blind spot in my eyes for the end user experience for participants. And, you know, they're doing the research, they're helping us out. So I find that blind spot uh, interesting to say the least. And my mouse has been flicking through PowerPoint all day today. So if it jumps around, I hope it doesn't jump around too much. Um, but really, why now? I do think anecdotally, it seems like researchers really are underrate or just don't like to do unmoderated research. User research really tends to be seems to be really associated with like those touchy feely, like the user interview. Um, I might be wrong if I actually did research into this to quantify, but that's sort of the vibe that I get, that researchers want to do, media research that seems to exclude unmoderated methods or methods that are, um, I guess, automated or mechanized or systemized. And, like userinterviews.com did an assessment uh, and is this just a question? Is this meeting being recorded covering my screen right now? Is that okay?
I don't understand your question.
Okay. No, I wasn't sure because I have the presentation on the second monitor and I saw the Zoom pop up on it and I wasn't sure if I was blocking what
We
was
can we can see your screen fine. Thank you.
Yeah,
perfect.
you can dismiss that too. You
Yeah, no,
should.
I dismissed it. Just wanted to make sure it was all good. Um, thank you all. But I found this really interesting, right? In terms of, even though this includes non-researchers, but you really see this over-indexing on interviews and usability testing. And while it doesn't explicitly include, um, moderated versus unmoderated, clearly the industry really relies on a few methods really a lot. And then the quote there is from the people who did this research. And, you know, there probably are people who are, not open to taking new approaches because they're maybe scared or afraid of doing it correctly or incorrectly. And, it shouldn't be this feedback loop where just because you hear about interviews or just because you hear about usability testing in a particular way, that's all you do, right? So, interviews are those things where people think it's just, just talk to users. Um, but there's so many ways to get the information that we're looking for. The need really isn't going away for human insight. I thought that was really interesting that, the demand, is going up. I'm not sure how that looks relative to 2023, 2022. Um, but also that Andreessen Horowitz, a prominent like VC company, has identified user research tools as a focus area for them of investment and have invested in the platform Sprig. When you think of VC, I personally think of like, high growth companies. So it'll be interesting to see if that pans out and how sort of those market forces will sort of encourage or discourage the practice of, user research. But In those cases, I think the only way to scale would be in unmoderated fashion, right? Or in a way that increases the effectiveness or scalability, or leverage of a user researcher. Correspondingly, like those platforms and capabilities are evolving quite rapidly. They're expanding to include, video responses and other things like that. But those are decisions that are made by companies that are influencing uh, us as practitioners, right? Because if we use user testing, we're limited by user testing's functionality. And I think it's important to think more about these methods and have our own opinions as practitioners. So if you're in a sales call, you can ask for specific features, but so we're not, just caught in this feedback loop of what you know these platforms are making. Speaking of dog fooding, I've seen a lot of bad unmoderated tests as a practitioner. Jacob Nielsen wrote bad user testing beats no user testing. Was almost going to say he's wrong, but he was very specific in saying user testing. I'll go into this a little bit later, but I personally believe that this has sort of set a little bit of a wrong precedent in how research is thought of. And, unmoderated sort of makes that easier to sort of do. The elephant in the room is obviously AI for many industries. And I don't really have an opinion either way. But I do think AI is making lots of parts of the research workflow much more efficient and enabling lots of things that a lot of researchers could only dream of and were sort of blocked by for many different reasons. But even if it doesn't replace user researchers, I think it'll enable a lot of those efficiencies and suggest or really push us to keep increasing our leverage. And so, how do you do that? I really do think that's unmoderated. That other elephant is that idea of like the democratization of research. It's this topic that keeps coming up year over year, catches wind on LinkedIn, gets amplified, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. This is a sentence I did not finish, but research platforms with those huge unmoderated abilities, I think, are a big facilitator of the perception that it can be democratized, or it can be scaled out. But I think those poor practices end up getting potentially democratized. So more reason for us to just think about how we should use unmoderated tools in our toolkits. And then, I fundamentally believe that unmoderated methods are really how researchers or UX people or people who do research can effectively scale their practices and drive change. But your perspective, I think, matters. So if you make certain assumptions about what an unmoderated method is or unmoderated tools are or can be, then maybe not. Maybe it isn't a tool that can help us scale or effectively drive change. Uh, Before I dive in, I'd really like to for the audience to consider a few questions, because I think the foundations that you have, whether you execute research, whether you consume research, I think it matters because it defines, your philosophy about research, data collection, et cetera, right? I always find it interesting to hear individuals' philosophies or what they really think they're doing. So if I use, the job to be done framework, like what is that strategic job? What is that core job that you are doing when you're performing research? Do you have a particular goal? I've heard a lot about, let's say, activating research and, really promoting specific decisions as outcomes of research. But what is that job really? Is it about decisions? Is it about just data collection? Is it about facilitating, user-centric decisions? I don't think there's a right answer, but I do think it will influence or inform how you sort of take in what I'm saying today, but also how you might apply some of these things that I'm talking about. And then, as I mentioned before about doing research, how user-centric are the studies that you design? Uh, I've personally noticed that the way I've talked about research, the way colleagues have talked about research, it's almost depersonalizing, sterile in the way we talk about some of our participants. I think some of that is just a natural consequence of the job. I think that's common phenomena in high touch sort of industries where you're working with individuals, but really thinking about procedurally how user centric this is, whether you're doing moderated or unmoderated, thinking about the recruitment process and how you're reaching out to them. Really, how user centric are the studies that you design? And have you completed an unmoderated test, and have you registered to be a participant on a testing platform? It's a really common thing in like if you take a psychology course in university to get course credit to complete research, right? It's part of this sort of cycle, pay back the research. But I ended up with a psychology undergrad, and that was really, really informative for me as a participant, actually doing that research. And I've continued that sort of tradition, and I still get paid like the $10 or whatever from the platforms I'm a part of. And when I conduct user research, or I participate in user research. But I think it's really important to do. And I don't lie about who I am. I do get rejected from a lot. But I think it's really important to understand what that end user experience is. And for me, this has given me like a professional sort of scouting of what's sort of happening in industry and how people are applying these tools. And it's really informed, I think, a lot of this perspective that I'm going to be talking about. Now I'm going to sort of briefly talk about a very, very, very brief history. I'm open to corrections. I think there are many more experienced practitioners here, but I think the level set of how things have sort of evolved over time is really, really important context setting when we talk about methods that we're applying today in user research and user testing. I think we all know that the Don Norman definition of UX is that it encompasses all the end user interactions, and it has its origins in ergonomics and human factors engineering. Those terms, usability or usability engineering, gained prominence in the 80s. And that term user-centered design, I believe, was popularized in 88 with that book with the teapot, Design of Everyday Things. Not too shortly after that, Nielsen wrote his academic paper, Usability Engineering at Discount. So my understanding is that, usability testing and things like that were really expensive affairs back then, lab environments, et cetera. And he was a pioneer in advocating for discount methods. In 1997, with the web, he published Discount Usability for the Web, really, really, really advocating for simplified user testing, cheaper usability work from a cost perspective, and those narrowed down prototypes. The quote I have on the right, we must evangelize methods simple enough that departments can do their own usability work fast enough that people will take the time, and cheap enough that it's still worth doing. I mentioned this idea of democratization earlier, and I find it interesting that that quote to me sounds very, very similar to the themes that you hear today about democratization. And the idea is that research has to be scalable or cheaper. And so I think this ethos of discount usability and sort of this idea, like Nielsen has obviously been very, very, very influential in industry. But in my mind, this has sort of set this foundation for how we think about research, right? We're always up against the broader organization and the perception of cost. And I think this has been really embedded um, in the practice, maybe because of Nielsen. I sort of think it is because of things like this that have been influential, or maybe it is just the context of the environments that UX people work in, right? Maybe it's just the fact that UX just isn't seen as profitable enough or valuable enough or whatever that may be. But this is a theme that has been consistent over time. Now, the industry has been evolving, and design and research capabilities have been basically commoditized. We have these platforms that make it so much easier to spin up a prototype, spin up a pretty advanced prototype. We have a lot of tools that let us do research and reach out to users in a much cheaper and more efficient way. And those contemporary tech practices or approaches to product development have become intertwined with our contemporary user experience practices. So NNG is probably like Nielsen Norman is, you know, I remember when I started in industry, it's like you would consult Nielsen Norman and things like that, but probably because they're successful, you don't really hear as much of them as their influence, or as much, or at least the dynamic has changed. Um, and I think that's probably a reflection of the success of UX and UX practitioners. Um, but I think that leads to the first sort of mistake that I want to, speak about today, which is really considering unmoderated to be its own sort of singular method. Unmoderated testing, and I should have written unmoderated research, but it's often referred to as its own method, often unintentionally and often implicitly. But really, I think almost all methods, like research methods, can probably be conducted in an unmoderated fashion. Although I do have a personal sort of beef if somebody uses the term unmoderated interview. I don't really think that's been possible until maybe recently with some of these advances with artificial intelligence like agents. But, you know, answering prompts verbally is not an unmoderated interview, right? That's just verbally responding. That's like a verbal survey. Um, but I think this is, just something that we see, right? A lot of people just don't make that distinction between unmoderated testing and research. Really, the term testing for a lot of people is synonymous with the term research, right? Concept creep is really, really rampant when you think about research, and maybe it's because I'm a researcher, but that precision that you need is lost, and it can be confusing, right? We people draw from their experiences, from how maybe the person they worked with at the previous company referred to it, right? And so people bring in these assumptions and things like that, and they mix up concepts, right? Jacob Nielsen, I sort of had a little bit of a criticism of what he said, but a lot of it is true, right? But it's true in the context of user testing. And a lot of the reason why I think it set maybe a poorer precedent is maybe not his fault specifically, but because of how these terms have evolved and how people unknowingly mix their approaches to research when they're drawing upon specific things, when it might only be applicable to testing, it might only be applicable to other contexts, right? And it doesn't help that I think a lot of us as researchers intentionally blend methods to get to be the most efficient, right? We might pair like a usability test for first half of a session with more of an interview at the latter half of a session, and generally just refer to that as user testing, right? When you have that concept creep, a diagram like this it really only makes sense when you're precise, right? Unmoderated testing falling under that quantitative quadrant and a little bit more behavioral and called out as being a scripted use of a product. Very, very accurate for unmoderated usability testing, right? When you're actually evaluating the performance of something and if there are errors, right? So you can quantify those errors. But if you're using it in a way that you're trying to, just use a prototype as a stimulus to generate thoughts and feelings and discussion, where would that fall, right? Where like you get more attitude. So should it fall more lower on the y-axis? Um, I personally define unmoderated as just a way to execute those methods without the involvement of a moderator. So this includes all data collections that don't have that active moderator involvement, including surveys and things like that. Amazon Mechanical Turk is this crowdsourcing platform, and I think this is an extreme example of what I would consider a unmoderated testing platform. They're basically a marketplace where people can do micro tasks, right? They log in, they do some screening. Sounds like unmoderated testing, right? And then they're asked to do a task, right? These types of platforms are often used for data labeling and things like that. And researchers in academia have validated the use of Mechanical Turk for interactive experiments in behavioral sciences like psychology, right? If you have the assumption that maybe people who are paid or doing this as a job, like professional testers, affect the quality of research. Well, in the case of these interactive experiments, they were quite valid. Uh, Another example that I consider an unmoderated method is microsurveys, right? At the bottom of this quick screenshot from Google from I do not know when, but those short focus questionnaires designed to gather that quick, specific information, right? A version of a survey presented in situ to get an understanding of the user's experience. Google uses a lot of forms of microsurveys to enrich their data and ensure that their data is of high quality, but we don't consider that user research very often. But that's just a delivery mechanism, right? They take that data, feed it into their backend, maybe improve the hours or something, right? That's very automated. But that delivery mechanism of maybe a survey before your YouTube video, that can easily be an unmoderated method for, user research. This is pulled from the inventory that Andreessen Horowitz did in one of their blog posts about the research platforms, and they frame it, in terms of how it's delivered, right? Is it video centric, survey centric, or panel centric? And I think when you compare it to that quadrant, this might be a better taxonomy to refer to unmoderated methods, because when you start digging into unmoderated methods, it's that delivery channel that begins to really matter, because that changes the context of when you can actually learn from users, etc. I'm not gonna in this the rest of this. I don't think I'm talking too much more about these things that wouldn't traditionally be owned by a user experience professional or have them involved. But I do think it's important to consider, things like those micro surveys that Google does as a potential user research method, and it firmly, in my eyes, belongs under an unmoderated user research method. The second mistake, in my opinion, is using discount usability as your research foundation, right? I think we all do this, unknowingly or not, we as UX practitioners, because it's been so influential, right? This approach was really, it focused on those three elements of simplified user testing, narrowed down prototypes, and heuristic evaluations. I really personally think it's a mistake because our capabilities have changed so much from then. And to execute this well, like narrow down prototypes, paper prototypes, it's I don't know if this applies to everybody in industry, But in many contexts I've been in, it's been strangely hard to get people to create low fidelity prototypes compared to high fidelity, right? So there's a little bit of me meeting the people I'm working with where they're at when I say maybe we should be, maybe it's a mistake to apply it this way. In my opinion, if the people we are partnering with as researchers are creating very, very high capability, high polished things compared to when these principles were developed and recommended, we should be evolving how we approach research to accommodate that instead of just applying these as like the low end of five, narrow down prototype or heuristic evaluations, instead of just reapplying that, right? So one example of that might be narrow down prototypes, right? If you have a very visually rich prototype and it's a Figma prototype, how about we create 5, 6 more interaction places where that enable a user to make a mistake and navigate back, right? As opposed to requiring somebody to follow what effectively becomes like a PowerPoint, a very, very, very linear journey. What I've noticed is that when you apply some of these principles, like a very linear path, the responses that you get become difficult to interpret and really hard to apply and just negatively affect the quality of responses, because it's just not rich enough and because people have these expectations, right? I'm trying to think, is there anything else? I could probably talk a lot about this or have a discussion about this. Um, I and mistake three is working backwards from moderated research methods. When you start doing research as a participant, when you see some bad ones, it really looks like somebody just imagine themselves speaking to a person in human and trying to just work backwards from that. I fundamentally believe that you just have to recognize that unmoderated is a completely different sort of modality. So it's much harder to do that way, right? Because you cannot control where a person goes or how they interpret, you have to be much, much, much more precise with how word, let's say, a question or probe or provide an instruction, right? And you have to learn how to, if you are providing instructions, to make it as clear as possible. I'm reminded of some of those team building games where it's like they're blindfolded and you have to, guide your partner and provide them with instructions, right? Because that tests your communication as the partner of telling them where to go. Like if you say turn right, how much are they going to turn right, left, etc., right? But that's not working backwards from an instruction to say like, if I just tell them to walk from point A to point B in a hallway, I just say walk down the hall, right? I think that you really have to approach it much more sort of natively with this idea of working, in an unmoderated testing platform to provide those right instructions. Similarly, I think people make ineffective compromises. I think we're always incentivized to try and answer the questions of people asking research of us. But I don't know if it's me. Sometimes it just feels like there's like this desperation, like we're trying to really like, get as much juice as we can out of something and we can't. And I find when you see a comparison table like this, I find it a little bit deceiving, right? It's there's no one present, as the participants complete the task, it has a lower cost, quicker turnaround. You can't, follow up with them, right? These are obvious. These are, real differences between moderated testing and unmoderated testing, but they don't tell a person who's, programming this research what's meaningfully different for how they might have to construct their tasks or things like that. And ignore the thing on the right, but Here are some differences. You know, unmoderated platform users are coached by the platform. You know, these platforms, they create incentives to coach, and they're incentivized to coach participants in a certain way, right? Because if they match a participant with a researcher, their client, their paying client, who doesn't follow the instructions or doesn't provide that feedback, then they're going to get complaints, right? And I do think it's important that to know that it's much easier to scale at a large end, but something I didn't include was that you still have to synthesize all that data if you're scaling it out to a large end. Some other differences on the moderated side is you can build that rapport and really understand. So, you can gather much, much richer data that's not just about asking questions and following up. You can understand the vibe of what's happening. I think there are some common anti-patterns that you really see happening uh, as people are making these compromises. One is prescriptive instructions. Two is that over reliance on attitudinal responses. And three is hunting for that specific answer or asking too many questions. Since most platforms you don't have the ability to control where you're going, people who do research offer prescriptive step-by-step constructions for a user, especially when they're moving from task to task, right? Uh, it it just introduces way more room for misinterpretation by the participant and user who is doing the research. Second is the overthinking and emphasis on think aloud. Uh, I think aloud is a hallmark. It's a staple of user testing, but um, they just, to follow up, they just ask so many of those specific questions after a task. And in my mind, you should be supporting natural interactions because, you're trying to observe natural behavior. I find it sort of like this, like you're doing the cardinal sin, like the 101 things that people tell you not to do, right? Like asking too specifically, asking you predict what you're doing. So when you start to over probe, you move much, much more away from that behavioral emphasis that user testing has or had. Uh, I will note that that's one of those things that discount usability relies on heavily, and that's one of those influences that I think has been um, a huge influence from Nielsen's article. These two quotes, the first one is from Nielsen Norman, right? Screen recordings are helpful, but it's easy to miss why a certain behavior occurred. Verbalizing that actions is essential, according to Nielsen Norman. The bottom quote is an example from usertestings.com's coaching, right? Explain what you're thinking so the customer knows why you like or dislike something. As a behavior focused person, I don't care half the time why somebody dislikes or likes something. I care how they used it, right? Customers rate videos how helpful they are. So the more detailed feedback you can provide, the more likely you'll receive a high rating. So even if myself as a researcher has not provided instructions to think aloud, usertesting.com is coaching these individuals to think aloud, but to think aloud a lot, right? It's over think aloud in my mind. So this is the mistake here when I say emphasizing on think aloud. It's both by the researcher and practitioner, but also by the platforms, right? And my hot take is that you do not need to understand why many times that you're doing research. You only have to care if they could perform the task or not, or if they could perform, with difficulty or with not. I think it's comforting to have why, and I think why can be valuable. I just don't think we need to chase the why. And I would think that the task performance is, sufficient. Worth debating, but I think these quotes are really interesting because it moves testing away from a behavioral sort of approach. As I mentioned before, hunting, where people who do research will just ask that litany of questions after a task. And presumably it's just to ensure they get that right response, right? Uh, I sort of think this is a symptom of poor decision making practices and poor decision making cultures where it seems to me that people need to hear somebody say, I want X or I did this, but and don't have that fluency to understand that behavioral data can inform a lot of that. So when we think about these anti-patterns, these are sort of my like pet peeves or complaints and things that I see that I honestly have done and I still do probably in sometimes. Um, when I think of recommendations or patterns that we should do, I really think that we should go back to a focus on the foundations of user testing and usability testing. And this enables tactics like running an experiment before the experiment. So I think we should be focusing on really specific task performance and benchmarks when we run unmoderated test methods. Usertesting.com offers tools like that help accelerate your synthesis, but this is only enabled, like the usefulness of a lot of these are only enabled if you focus your construction of a test in a performance driven way. So this is a quick screenshot of their path analysis. So you can see the paths that a user took where they clicked their actual click through the prototype. They have time on task based on the clicks as well. I'm 99% sure the company I work for is no longer a client. But if you emphasize think aloud too much, that time on task data becomes useless, right? Because um, you're adding a huge variable based on what a customer is thinking, saying, and if usertesting.com is coaching them, you just can't rely on that data as a comparison. Now, if you're not a client of user testing, what you can do is that there are some other tools in market as well. Um, I don't, yeah, the video didn't work, but there's a tool. It's a funny name, quantux.com, but it's a prototyping tool and it has analytics built in. So you can look at click maps, you can look at that path analysis, and it's completely free. I don't know if they're ever going to monetize, but this is something that you can do where if you build a prototype a certain way and you construct your tasks in a way that's mindful of how a user might use it, then you can actually take a look at the data in a quantitative way. There's a lot of benefits because if you look at this quant data, uh, depending on how you've constructed the test, you can really, really quickly get a read on how successful a design was without having to go through the recordings, right? In my mind, having this quantification and these quantification tools is and has been sort of like a little bit of a missing link for a lot of unmoderated test platforms because synthesis can be time consuming. So without this, it's still very time consuming for many people, but having strong quant signals can actually make unmoderated testing truly efficient for a practitioner. So then again, focusing on those elements enables those clear objective in quotes objective if you're agreed upon like performance as this measurement. Uh, so it enables those insights that you can draw from. And as I mentioned before, it actually provides a path to faster insight. My second recommendation is retrospective think aloud, right? I think you should be discouraging live think aloud protocol. And instead of asking questions right after an individual task, arrange your test in two key phases. Again, this is very behavioral. So let a user complete all their tasks to the best of their abilities. Once they're complete, or once they're complete a set of tasks, then ask about their perceptions of elements on the screen, their thoughts, and their experiences. This protocol allows a user to naturally use that stimulus, that prototype, and click through, and actually sort of, depending on the fidelity of your prototype, make those mistakes. And you'll gain more of a naturalistic result and insight because you can actually get them to make sort of the mistakes, things that happen in moderated testing, and naturally, recover without the questions that you're asking, like interrupting it. A symptom that I've seen sort of the over asking is chunking sort of a big task into like half tasks, right? But then you can actually ask that final task like end to end, and then ask some of those questions later. This relates to pattern 3, which is deep links. I call them deep links, but links specifically to a place in a prototype. Obviously, in unmoderated testing, since a user isn't monitored, they can go off, they can script a prototype, right? And so what I found is people who do research might instruct people to go to specific locations, etc. But you don't need one prototype, right? You can have multiple prototypes, or you can link to specific places in the prototype. So to enable what I mentioned about retrospective think aloud for number 2, to ask them about their thoughts and experiences, if you still have to ask that question about what did you think button A was going to do, then just deep link them to that screen after they're done, because that's a built-in capability to your user testing platform, and then ask them those questions. So in other words, prototype, task, 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 link to a spot in the prototype, ask them the question you had specifically, link to another spot in the prototype, ask them that question specifically. This is just a pattern that lets you control provide you with additional control for those times when a customer might veer off into the wrong place. Pattern 4 is using diagnostic questions. I believe this is just a default pattern in a platform like usertesting.com, but questions like, how clear was that task? How well did you think I don't know the specific questions, but how easy that was, how clear it was. Did you think you completed that task successfully? If you decide to deploy tests at a appreciable scale, beyond, let's say, 10 users, this can be very, very helpful for you to identify when a test goes wrong. And it can be a great diagnostic, again, to rapidly understand how your results are doing. This accelerates the synthesis because then you do not need to go through the full recording. Maybe they're only having trouble with the last task. You can look at the summary results in your platform, and then based on that, go to that session, go to that timestamp, and actually zoom in and figure out, what went wrong. I think there's a lot of value in purposefully adding sort of points of interaction to get analytic signals or diagnostic signals, both in real life products and in a test like this. This is the one thing where I regret not having a video, but integrate your prototype into the process. You can just put instructions of what to do in your prototype, or add error conditions in your prototype to help guide a user. So I worked with a designer. When you think about prototypes and hotspots, we were working on a linear prototype, but we knew that users might try different buttons, and only one button is where they would go specifically. So this person had rigged up basically 2 hotspots. One was basically the entire screen, and one was the actual button for the right path. If a user, hit the wrong hotspot, the big hotspot, too many times, an error would actually show up to help nudge the user along. So this is another tactic that actually worked out, quite well. And I think we think about these prototypes and the platform very, very separately. But we were thinking about this. I think the big insight from the designer was thinking about this in an integrated fashion in the end user's experience, right? And I think there's lots of different things that you can do. The one caution I'd have here is to test it out, like really test it out, because it can be a little bit confusing within a recorder or your prototype. And the last one is I've talked about this verbally, but dog food it, right? Like try out a testing platform. I think the most insight and the reason why a talk like this has been on the back of my head is because I've done and continue to be a participant in user research, and so many things just didn't make sense. Like there were small mistakes here and there, and things that just sent me in the wrong path. Or because I'm a researcher, I understood why they were, doing some things. But I really truly think, like, I think it's Microsoft, were they the ones who invented this? But the term dog fooding, but eating your own dog food, right? Like really actually understanding that end experience for user can make tremendous, tremendous, tremendous difference in I think how you design and actually execute a test. Uh, this wraps up basically everything I had on deck. Um, I probably have plenty of other thoughts, but open to like Q&A, and maybe I can elaborate there.